Welcome to our breakout session, where we're going to be talking about the United Nations LGBTI workplace standards and how they can help us to build a more inclusive workplace. And I'll be talking about some of the work that Workplace Pride has been doing on that over the last few months. So my name is Graham Sparks. I run my own diversity and inclusion consulting practice. I'm also a member of the advisory board of Workplace Pride, having been connected with David Pollard and his team for a number of years. And my previous role was head of diversity and inclusion with Shell. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of the day, the session rather, on the right-hand side, you'll see the agenda, and it's just going to take a couple of minutes over the introduction. Then I'll spend probably about 20 minutes talking through the work that we've been doing to create the Workplace Pride toolkit to support these United Nations standards. And then a critical piece, we're going to have a dialogue with two leaders who are actively involved in this. And I think on your screens, you should see the small thumbnails of Pedro and Joyce. And later on, they will become big images as we change around the scenery slightly. And we'll be having a dialogue around why and how they're using the toolkit and the standards within Shell and with Dow, and then there'll be some time for a Q&A. Now, as audience members, and nice to see our audience is growing quite quickly, you will remain on mute. Obviously, you're hearing and seeing us, but if you'd like to pose a question, if you type your questions in the conversation box, which should be on the left-hand navigation, it's sort of like a call out with a couple of lines in it. Type your questions in there. I'll try and monitor them as we go through, but we'll allow some time at the end when we can deal with some of those questions as we come through. So just by way of introduction, I think Mark Emden said a little bit about this at the beginning, but we're living through some very strange, very tumultuous times for the moment. And for me, it's a time when inclusion and collaboration are perhaps even more important than ever, particularly as businesses restart and we try and recover from the pandemic. And also, I mean, sadly for me, we see the pandemic is also impacting LGBT communities across the world. And for me, I think, our real concern is we see, unfortunately, daily evidence of rising homophobia in various places. And I think it's true to say at times of stress, that's when people, and in some cases politicians, look to blame marginalized groups. I was just looking at some headlines I'd seen this week, and I'm sure many of you have seen them as well. So, headline, Britain to drop plans to make changing gender easier. A discussion around transgender rights, but also something that J.K. Rowling seems to have entered. And whatever that, it's a big debate, of course, but it's led to positions being taken on the left, on the right, and I think already causing, I would say, quite some damage to the underlying cause. Another one, LGBT activists protest at Polish president's campaign rally, and we see the right-wing party in Poland, using homophobia as some sort of platform to rally their base. But again, Mark mentioned it, some good news. U.S. Supreme Court a ruling boosts a legal argument for LGBT rights, and I think it was just yesterday, Swiss Parliament's lower house backed their same-sex marriage bill. So, some negatives, but also some positives around as well. And I think that's important for the context of this session, where we're going to talk about the United Nations LGBTI workplace standards, talk about what they are, why they matter, and probably most importantly, how companies are going around using them. And we'll put that in the context of the work we've been doing at Workplace Pride, which is to develop a toolkit, which is now live on the Workplace Pride website, to help implement those standards and to drive more inclusive, more inclusion in the workplace. So again, the agenda is on the right. You'll see the thumbnails of Joyce and Pedro hopefully at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do proper introductions when we get to the session on dialogue. And once again, if you have questions, just type them into the conversation box, and as I say, I'll monitor as we go through, but certainly we'll try and pick up some of those questions at the end. Lastly, we'll have a hard stop at let me get the timing right, 4:30 Dutch time, because at that point we have to go back to the main session for the rest of the program. Before I get into the main content, and this is another little experiment with this wonderful platform, but let me just, I've just got a poll that I'd like to pick up and just get a sense of our audience of, there's 47 in our audience today, and a little bit of a sense of what you know about these standards. So I'm hoping, if this is all working, a poll is appearing on your screen with a question: what do you already know about the UN LGBTI Standards of Conduct for Business? And I'd be grateful if you could just quickly vote there. I'll give it 30 seconds. I see some votes already coming in from people. There is no right and wrong of this, of course, but just put your votes in, and then I'll close the poll in just a moment, and then we'll get a sense of where everybody is. So the numbers are still moving around a little bit. Obviously, it's working, and yeah, thank you very much for that. I'll close the poll, and then hopefully we can just share the results. There. Oh, sorry. Something went wrong there. Anyway, I did see the results, and it was it seemed to be a balance between knowing about the standards and having no knowledge at all. So quite a split between the audience here today. And for the second question, I'll try and press the right button so you can actually see the results. The second question for you is coming up in just a moment now. And again, a straightforward one. Do you know if your organisation has already endorsed the UN LGBTI Standards of Conduct for Business? Yes, no, or don't know. This is coming through even quicker, much more clearer question, hopefully. So again, probably for about half the audience, some questions to ask when you get back to your virtual office as to whether you have or have not, and if not, why not. Some know, and that's understandable. We'll talk a bit more about the companies that have endorsed the standards in a moment. And then for a healthy, 38% of companies have already endorsed them. So that gives you a bit of a mix. We've got a nice mixed audience today. Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to the content now. Again, I just have to make sure I press the right buttons. And yeah, there we go. So yeah, hopefully, oops, sorry. Seeing that as well. Right, let's, so again, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go about 20-minute run through of around the standards and around the toolkit, just to give you a sense of what these are all about and why they matter, and then we'll go into the dialogue a little bit later on. If I just, again, you'll see the slight challenges here of pressing the right buttons at the right time. Yeah, there we go. Apologies. Okay, yeah, should be seeing that now. So let me just give you a quick overview of this. And what you're seeing now is the toolkit, the online toolkit, which you will find on the Workplace Pride website. Our toolkit to support United Nations LGBTI standards. I'm going to go through this really in three main sections. Something about what are the standards, why do they matter, and then how to use. The piece on sustaining progress I won't spend much time on, partly because we don't have that much time, but secondly, and more importantly, because Joyce and Pedro will be discussing that when we get to the dialogue section. So we'll cover that piece in there. So we'll focus on what, why, and how. Moving straight on with the what, let's give you some of the basics of this. The background to this, again, I won't go through all the detail here, and again, you can see all of this material on the Workplace Pride website. The United Nations LGBTI Standards was developed back in 2017. And really, you could trace the roots right back to 1948 and the Declaration of Human Rights. And they will focus very much about creating the right environment, or a better environment, for LGBT inclusion in the workplace, but both looking within the workplace, but also externally. And there's some great work that the UN have done here around customers, around suppliers, and also around connection with civil society and advocacy, acting in the public sphere as they call it. So that was the background. And over the last few years, the United Nations Human Rights group has managed to get 270 companies to endorse these standards. You can click on the link in the toolkit and see all the names of those companies, and roughly 25, 26 workplace pride organisations have already endorsed that. And we saw from the poll, 37% of people on this in this breakout work for organisations who've already endorsed these standards. However, there was a problem, and when I was working at Shell, I picked up these standards. You can see a little icon here, which there's a PDF which you can find again on the Workplace Pride website, which gives you the standards. There's a short version, 8 pages. There's a long version, it's about 48 pages. Great work, but a lot of dense text. A few diagrams, and frankly not so much advice on what actually to do with it. I'm not undermining the work. It is great work, but it's about how do you make it practical, and how do you make it practical for busy people. So there might be diversity and inclusion people who have 100 objectives and 100 priorities to deal with, or they might be people within the business who you're trying to get their attention. How do you get their attention quickly, and how do you make this practical? So the last year with Workplace Pride, what we've been doing is to develop a toolkit, and I'll take you through that in a moment, which takes the themes from the UN standards and puts some practical actions behind them, actions we can take within our organisations. And as you look at this and hopefully review it after the session, I'd ask you to look quite broadly at this. And this is not just about, has my company endorsed the UN standards or not? It's also about what is your LGBTI workplace inclusion strategy? Does it need a refresh? Is it complete? Other things you can learn from others? Other areas that you struggle with? Are you doing a great job within the organization but struggle externally? What about the more sensitive countries? What actions do you take there? So try and think about this, and think about both the UN guidelines but also the Workplace Pride Toolkit in terms of refreshing or re-energizing your LGBTI work. And again, as I said at the beginning, with the change we're going through, perhaps now is as good a time as any in order to do that refresh. So that's the background, the dilemma, and a little bit about the Workplace Pride solution. Quick overview of the standards. Again, you can read much more about this by picking up those documents, but they essentially came up with 5 standards or 5 themes going from left to right, from respect to human rights on the left-hand side through to act in the public sphere on the right-hand side. There's a lot in there actually about getting the basics right. So this might be about code of conduct, it might be about HR policy, it might be about effective employee networks. But as you go through it, you'll see stuff which becomes, not necessarily in everyone's strategy. Some of it can be in the more difficult area, some of it can be in the external area. So getting into customer and supplier relationships. And as I said earlier, what can companies do around advocacy, collective action, social dialogue, etc., which I know a lot of organisations, and I include my former employer, find difficult. But again, still things that we can do in that area. So look at it across the piece. It's not start with the basics and then go for the more difficult stuff across the piece. Look at what you can do in each of those areas. What are you doing well? Where are the gaps? And what more could you do? So that covers the headlines of this. If we then move to the next section about why they matter, every organization, every big organization will have some form of business case for LGBTI inclusion. And what we've tried to do at Workplace Pride is to synthesize those. And over the last few months, I've read a lot of these business cases from a lot of top-class companies, and we've tried to distill them into 3 issues, which you can see here. I'm going to return to this later on in a little bit more detail, but you'll see a business case which is built up of talent and leadership, productivity and performance, and then brand and reputation, which already gets you into the external piece of this. But also on the left-hand side, I think something that's becoming increasingly important, and is not, in my view, is not an either or. They need to go together, which is a social and moral case, which in simple terms is just simply being the right thing to do. But how do we articulate that? How do we get the message across? What can we actually do about it? How do we have that dialogue in the more sensitive countries in the world? So again, this is if you like, a generic business case. Obviously, you will have your own business cases, but maybe time to look at it, refresh it. Is it up to date? Is there something more you can do about it? Is there something more you can do to link it to your business? And this is a starting point in order to do that. In developing these standards, we've tried this toolkit. We've tried to take an external perspective, and we've been fortunate. And again, I'll let you read this, so you can read all this at a later date. But we've had support for our toolkit from both the United Nations, who obviously put together the original standards, but have also been supportive in terms of workplace pride and the work that we've been doing. And also very pleased to recently receive support from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Netherlands, again supporting what we're doing. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been terrific in terms of looking particularly at that external piece, public action, public advocacy, acting in the public sphere, etc. And again, I won't spend time on these, but you'll see various statements from workplace pride members as to why they think these standards are important as well. So, maybe if your company hasn't endorsed these yet, or maybe your company has endorsed them but hasn't done anything, then this can create, shall we say, a nice competitive spirit within your organization as to what others are doing as well. Again, a lot of this is for later reading. I'm just going to do a quick look at the questions as they come through. Yeah, good. Okay, that's fine. There's one or two questions coming up there, and I'm going to pause on those and come back to them at the end. So I'll just have to drop that off. Yeah, there we are. Right. Right, let's get to the heart of this, and then fairly soon we'll get into our dialogue with Joyce and with Pedro. And this is about how to use. So we've talked about what are the standards. There's facts, there's data, there's information there. Why are they important? So we talked a bit about the business case, and also I've shown you the headlines of some of the both the external endorsements we've got, but also workplace pride member endorsements as well as to why this matters. But let's really look at how to use, how to make this practical, how to take it from that nice PDF which the UN supplies us with into what you can actually do within the workplace. And we've looked at this, and we've designed the toolkit really in 4 pieces. First of all is getting started, and that's about asking some fairly basic questions. What do you looking at LGBTI workplace inclusion? What do you aspire to? Where are you today? And what do you need to do to get started, or maybe progress from where you already are? So those, and again, there's some further guidance around what to think about in that area, and make sure you've grounded this well. The second piece, and I'll come back to that in a moment, is around action planning. And for each of those 5 themes, we have a set of action templates which suggest ways to get into this in more detail. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment. Thirdly, we've collated or curated, I think is the correct word, all the good practices which have come out of the Workplace Pride benchmark over the last couple of years, and use those as examples of good practice which support support implementation of the UN standards. Now, of course, there are many good practices around. It's not just a case of selecting those that Workplace Pride develop, although I would argue they're very relevant. But again, it's about looking for that external information, being curious, asking the questions, networking with customers, networking with suppliers, and bringing those other best practices into your own work. And lastly, and I won't spend time on this today purely because of time, we've come up with a generic implementation plan. And the important thing about that is not to try and do 20 or 25 things things at the same time, but to do a few things well, to do a few things which hopefully will make a difference. So that's the overall landscape or navigation of the Workplace Pride Toolkit, and I want to just jump very briefly into the action planning section and give you a bit more depth on that. So if we just go to the next one, yeah, there we go. So when I showed you the headlines for what are the UN LGBTI standards, those 5 themes, those 5 standards: respect human rights, eliminate discrimination, provide support, prevent other human rights violations, and lastly, acting in the public sphere. And what we've done in our toolkit, we've come up with 12 templates. Again, you can see them listed 1 to 12. I won't go through them all, but for each of those areas, you'll find some more detail, which looks at what actions we believe you need to take, who needs to take the actions, and some further resources to look at if you want to dive into that in more detail. Some of them will be quite familiar, probably already, things like the business case, perhaps HR policy and practice. Self-identification, very important, but also can be quite difficult. And then over on the right-hand side, some of the things around customers, advocacy and diplomacy, civil society interface. You may be aware of them, but do you have a plan for them? What action can you take? And again, what we're trying to do is to help with that. And I repeat what I said earlier, it's not just about implementing these standards, it's also about looking at your overall approach on LGBTI inclusion in the workplace and seeing what more you can do with that. Just as one example, and again, there's more to share through the Workplace Pride website. Let's just touch on the LGBTI business case, and each of our action plans, action templates has a similar format. You'll see a box which has usually 6 or 8 suggested actions. They've been gathered through a series of interviews with Workplace Pride member companies, including Dow, including Shell. We've also taken third-party information from organizations like Open for Business, for example. There's terrific stuff out there. The problem is sometimes there's too much stuff, so we've tried to curate that to make it simple to get access to. In the middle, we've suggested who needs to take action. Let's get the accountability clear and get the tracking clear. And over on the right-hand side, and again, carefully curated for each of the action areas, we've come up with 3 tools or 3 areas to go for further information and advice. And this one happens to have some content from Workplace Pride, from Open for Business, and lastly from EY. And again, I won't show them all, but if you go through each of the templates, then you can see different tools to help you there. So think of it this way: you start at the top with the 5 standards. That moves down to 12 action areas, and for each action area, you can keep going deeper, depending on the interest, but depending on the need, depending on the complexity, depending on your organization. And from that, you can hopefully bring out the steps and the actions which are really going to make a difference. Lastly, just to wrap up before we go to the dialogue. I mentioned the good practices, another part of the toolkit, and again, these have all been curated, and you can see from there's about 9 or 10 different companies on here, and for each of these areas, you can jump one level lower and see, for example, Dow have got some best practice on inclusion and engagement, and Shell have also got something on inclusion and engagement. I promise you that's just a coincidence as to how they came up. So again, let's just summarize this before we go to the dialogue. The UN standards developed 3 years ago. Great piece of work, certainly worth reading, but not easy to implement just quickly. You know, a lot of good content, but not so obvious what to do with that content. The Workplace Pride Toolkit tries to take that forward by explaining what are the standards, why they matter, but most importantly, how to use them. And again, my encouragement is to look at that in the context of your overall work on inclusion in this area, and see what actions and what activities and what best practice may help you going forward. So that was a quick run through. I'm going to move us now to a dialogues discussion, and hopefully if Pedro and Joyce have got their microphones now on. I'm delighted to be joined today by Joyce and by Pedro, and I'll allow them to do their own proper introductions in a moment. Joyce Peirsman from Dow, Pedro Rumayor from Shell, both of whom have worked with me in developing the toolkit, and were generous in giving their time to various interviews and a workshop we did to bring out all these ideas and all these best practices which are going on in workplace pride member organisations. And they're going to join me today for a short dialogue where we're going to dive a bit deeper on this and look a bit further about why the standards are important and how their companies are going about implementing them. So, if I may, what I'd like to do is hand over to perhaps first to Joyce and then to Pedro. Really, just give a quick introduction and how you're involved with LGBTI workplace inclusion, and then we'll get into the questions. And again, for audience members, please keep typing any questions you have in the conversation box, and we'll deal with those when we've had the dialogue. So, Joyce, over to you, please.
Thank you, Graham. First of all, it's an honor to be with you today. So as Graham mentioned, I work for Dow, and basically I work in supply chain improvements, which is focused on customer experience and quality. But next to that, I'm a steering team member and the secretary for GLAD in the Benelux chapter, and one of the contact persons between WPP and Dow. And so I've been working with Graham a lot on this important piece that hopefully will allow you to bring this GLAD or LGBTI network in your own company to the next level.
Joyce, thanks for that intro, and Pedro, if I may ask the same from you, please.
Maybe just checking. Can you hear me?
I hear you fine. Thank you. The audio and visual seems to be working, and I've had that confirmation from Pauline online as well.
Yeah, no, I'm surprised that the technology is working so well today. But, thanks, Graham, for the invitation, and of course, also very, very pleased to be here today, sharing this, I guess, virtual stage with you and Joyce and. Yeah, so obviously for those in the audience, my name is Pedro, and as Graham also mentioned, so I've been working at Shell now for the last 6 years, and what is essentially a commercial finance role in our M&A department. And that's really my day job. And I like to steal the joke one of my colleagues made in one of the internal webcasts that we had on LGBTI. She said, well, I have a day job and a gay job, and actually that also applies to me. So, and that's really the reason why I'm here today. So over the last 4 years or so, perhaps longer, I've been leading our LGBT plus group within Shell in the Netherlands. Obviously, Graham, when you were part of Shell, we worked very closely together in this. And recently, I stepped down from that role, but I guess I feel too attached and too committed to really go in retirement. So here I am. I'm still sort of trying to contribute in any way I can.
Very good. Thanks, Pedro, and to both of you. Welcome to the session today. Yeah, really to open this up a bit and hopefully provide a bit more thoughts for our audience. Could you both give us some ideas about why your company? So why is Dow and why has Shell chosen to endorse the UN LGBTI standards, and why do they matter? Joyce, maybe start with you.
Sure. I think I could start off by echoing what you said before, that it's simply the right thing to do. They matter to us because we want to foster a safe, inclusive, and supportive open working environment. I think we've said it before, but bring your whole self to work is super important. And we wish to transform Dow's culture such that sexual orientation, gender identity, and expressions are really irrelevant. And then I think secondly, if we ask ourselves the question to your business, do we have all of the different skills, perspectives, experiences inside of the company that we need to achieve our goals? I think that's a really good question to ask ourselves, and which brings me to perhaps the second part, why it's important that we bring them into Dow. And it's just that inclusion and diversity is essential to attract, develop, retain top talent that we want and that we need to successfully implement our strategy.
Thanks, Joyce. I love that. So it's a firm business case, but I also like your line. The vision ultimately you make this irrelevant, which is great. So thanks for that, Pedro. Again, for you, why does this matter to Shell, and why has Shell chosen to endorse the standards?
Yeah, no, thanks, Graham. And of course, I could obviously, when I hear Joyce just say why it matters to Dow, I can only sort of agree with that, right? But I mean, specifically on why we chose to endorse the standards, I think. Well, probably can come up with a lot of reasons, really, but at the end of the day, it comes down to one thing, really, and at least I think, it's because we believe in the standards, right, and we believe in LGBTI inclusion. I think as an organization, we not only want to demonstrate our commitment to LGBTI rights and human rights in general, but I guess we also have to recognize that as members of society, we also have a pretty big responsibility and an even bigger role to play in ensuring equality for all, whether that is LGBTI individuals or whether it's people of ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, right? And really looking more in detail into the standards, I think once you start kind of getting into it and as you say, reading all those 48 pages and even more when we look at the toolkit, I think very quickly we realize they're very closely aligned with who we are as an organization, and actually also even closer to our company's goals. And I think Joyce mentioned, right, one of our main goals is to create an environment that is safe and an environment that is inclusive to all, and an environment in which individuals like myself and yourselves can really bring their true and authentic selves to work. And that needs to be every day, and it needs to be in every places around the world, right? I mean, at Shell, and you know this quite well, of course, Graham, our core values are honesty, integrity, and respect for people. And these values and I guess inclusion and diversity in general are an integral part of the culture that we have. And that's really also how we want to operate within our company, but also in society and in all the communities where we operate. Now, if I kind of move a bit towards, I guess, the second part of the question of why they matter, I think, often I think organizations fail to understand the amount of power and influence that they have, and how, if we are able to come together, this collective power would really help us to, bring about the change that we need in society. So I think of the standards in a way to serve as an important reminder, I guess, of this responsibility that we have, and also to help us as I guess, valuable guidelines or almost best practices on how we can be that agent of change and ultimately create, extend that culture of respect and equality from within the company, but also even beyond to our communities. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. And I also, I think what I hear so loud and strong, I've been doing this for a few years now, and both of you have talked about right thing to do, about values, about link to safety, to psychological safety, you said there, Pedro. 5-6 years ago, it would have been a different dialogue. It would have talked about the business case in terms of talent and leadership and customers and employees. Not that that's unimportant, but it seems to have been a shift. And for me, in the current climate, particularly with this business recovery phase we're entering, I find that very positive. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we do have a number of questions coming up, which I'd like to give the respect to the audience to try and pick up some of those. So let me just try and perhaps bring two questions together here to hear your responses. And that really is, again, looking at both Dow and Shell. How are you going about implementing this work and perhaps using the Workplace Pride Toolkit? And secondly, so two parts of the question: what challenges are you coming up with? So how are you going about the implementation, and what challenges are you coming across? Who wants to go first?
I'll go, and I'll keep it brief, looking at the time.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah.
So sorry. I mean, first of all, I think that there's many ways to use the UN Toolkit and bring it to the needs and vision of your company. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong or bad, and I think we can all learn from each other, which is why today, and Pedro and myself, talking is I think very important, and equally to learn from others. But I think if I would be to share some of the insights on how DAO is evolving in this part and what we did more specifically so others can benefit, I think awareness and education is key. So we have given the Diamond Standard Code of Conduct and specific trainings in regards to LGBTI to more than 1,600 employees, shared business cases with more than 1,000 leaders. We do keep a survey on a yearly basis where we offer the possibility to voluntarily, obviously, self-identify as an LGBTI. And we use that to validate our progress year to year. But it's also the smaller things that count. Having a rainbow cup, for instance. This 2020, it's our 20th birthday, by the way, for our ERG GLAD.
Oh, wow.
And we've been launching Pride at Home, which was a video and photo campaign to support each other. But we also held a virtual coffee break to raise awareness to loneliness and support during COVID-19. And we just yesterday, basically, we had a virtual Pride parade. So there's lots to share and equally even more opportunities. So I could go on probably all day. But yes, just to show that, this is some of the practical things that we've brought into this year and in the history to really educate, bring awareness, make people feel at home in DAO, get used to the standards. That goes top down. If I may close off by saying that obviously we are super happy that we have the full engagement of our CEO, Jim Fitterling, who both, I think, internally and externally inspires employees and other companies in the same industry and beyond.
That's great. I love the practical applications that you use, taking this from the lofty high level of the UN down to the practical steps of DAO. So that's terrific. Thanks, Pedro. Again, if we just hear briefly from you, please.
Yes, and I see already some of the questions indeed coming also as well in terms of actual challenges. So maybe I'll focus a bit more on that part.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Yeah.
And just going to briefly say that I'm quite happy that over the last couple of months I've been involved in a piece of work directly with our executive committee and working hand in hand with our chief financial officer on developing essentially what it is or I hope will be a strategy on how we continue to advance the topic of LGBT inclusion within Shell, and with a very specific focus on the more sensitive countries, we like to call them. So obviously these are the locations which are less LGBTI friendly and often, where it is even criminalized. I wish I had sort of a straight answer to this question, right? But clearly it's not. And I think one of the things that we've realized as we've gone through our journey is that there is no one size fits all approach, really. What is important, though, is we need to have a very clear global vision in terms of where we want to be. And again, this needs to be grounded on a clear view on sort of our core values and what we stand for as a company, right? And at the very center of it needs to be the safety of our staff. And this is really how we approach it also in the more difficult locations. We need to always keep in mind the safety of the staff and really only do things that we feel comfortable in doing that also will not put them at risk in any way, right? But really, it's quite difficult. I think when I think about some of the stuff that come in the standards around communication and raising awareness. I mean, some of the experience that we've had in some of the countries in the Middle East where we operate, for example. Before we were always having very open global communications on our intranet pages in Shell where everybody could see it from around the world. I think more recently, because of some, I guess pushback you could say from some of these countries, we've moved away from that. But we also realize, we need to be careful on how we bring this and one of the things that I've learned from that is sometimes, taking a bit of a step back because it's helpful because, you don't want to antagonize people either. And there's other subtle ways where you can, for instance, bring the topic, right? Again, center around respect, center around
Yes.
our values and the safety of our staff. I think, you also need to be a bit creative, and that's one of the things I love about what's happening now around the world. People are getting very creative, and one of the things that I encourage people to do as well is, rather than have me as a white man from the Netherlands coming into Qatar and tell about LGBTI inclusion, is trying to find someone who people can relate better to, raising this topic. It obviously is a lot more impactful, and that's where allies have a very strong role to play. We encourage some of our very senior leaders, for example, in their visits to wear rainbow lanyards. You're not necessarily saying anything verbally, right? But you're very clearly sending a very strong signal of what kind of culture we have in the company, and so this is some of the things. But again, it's I hope I'm giving a bit of flavor as to some of these challenges.
Pedro, thank you, and again, Joyce, thank you for that. And I think I capture that from something I know I've probably said. Other people in the call may have heard me say this before, but yes, sadly, we know there are a number of countries in the world where it is illegal to be LGBT. But I've yet to find a country in the world where it is illegal to be respectful.
Absolutely.
So starting the conversations around respect can help enormously. Thank you both for that. Just in view of the time, what I'm going to do, please obviously stay with us. I'm just going to change the scene back to this and bring in some of our audience questions. Now, one of them is just, and forgive me, everyone, I should have done this earlier, but one is just the basic follow-up on this, and hopefully there's a slide showing up on the screen now in terms of follow-up, and essentially what you'll find on the Workplace Pride website is two things. One is a public version of this toolkit available to anyone, and the slides that you've seen today are in that toolkit. You can see two versions. There's an interactive one where all the links work, and you can go off and click the links and find out how many, which companies have endorsed the standards. You can click through the various links to the other resources, etc., and that will give you a lot of what you need to follow up on this session, should you choose to do that. For Workplace Pride members, there is a fuller version of the toolkit which goes into more detail on those action templates I'm talking about. And again, the 75 Workplace Pride members can find that on the website as well. If you're not a member but you'd like to get access, contact Workplace Pride through info@workplacepride.org. I know the slide's only up on the screen now, but again, you will find that information on the Workplace Pride website. Just in terms of Q&As, and I think, Pedro and Joyce, you've covered some nice parts around this already, but there's a number of questions around progressing with this in more sensitive countries, and again, there is some specific guidance in the toolkit in terms of doing that. There's also a question early on from sorry, I'm just scrolling to the right place now. From Nicolette about examples of how civil society interfaces have worked out in practice. So the question is, can you give examples of how civil society interface has worked out in practice? I'll come to Pedro and Joyce in a moment. I just want to give my own observation. Worked for Shell for all those years. The last year or so, I've been working with a number of not-for-profits. And I can only tell you is that both organizations, those big corporates and those small not-for-profits, have great intent, great purpose, great vision, great mission, but it's almost like two parallel universes going on. And it's quite extraordinary. And it's not about, I mean, I suppose if you cynically would say it's about trust, but it's just that, we have our direction and you have your direction. And what I've seen, and I did see some of this coming together through Shell and organizations like Workplace Pride help enormously, that when those two spheres come together and talk about the issues of implementing LGBTI inclusion plans in the Philippines, in Russia, in the Middle East, and working with local NGOs, that's when the magic starts to happen, and that's when things start to get different. So I think it's about a lot of organizations, I'm sure, already supporting those civil society organizations, but it's not just about providing resource or providing cash. It's also about taking part in that dialogue as well. So how well is that going on, and how much are we bringing those two spheres together? That's a bit of a personal view, but observation over the last year. Pedro, Joyce, did you have anything you wanted to add briefly on that question around civil society interface?
Yeah, I think maybe just you touched on it already, right? But I think it's important to align interests, right? And I think like in any other partnership or relationship, is understanding how we can support each other, right? Ultimately, I think our goals are the same when it comes to this, right? So it's a matter of being willing and able to have that conversation in the first place. And I do like your point around sort of going local. I think I find it that because the reality and the issues are so unique to the different locations and countries, etc., that having the right partner and yeah, working together with local partners is the best way to do it, at least from our experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. Joyce, anything you wanted to add, or should we move to the next question?
No, we can cover other questions. I could only echo Pedro. It's pretty much aligned.
Yeah. There's another question here about leadership and getting, I think broadly about getting leadership engaged, particularly in companies that are less progressive, have less progressive practices. I've always believed in friendly competition, and the very fact that, I mean, I know I only put them up for 20 seconds, but the fact that we have a number of other companies endorsing these standards, that we've got the UN and the Dutch Foreign Affairs endorsing a toolkit, it all helps. That external focus can help. And certainly I know from my Shell days, and Pedro, you were involved with this, getting suppliers involved and having discussion around the supply chain. Yes, it was a constructive conversation, but it also worked because it was touching on commercial relationships as well. So I think there are ways to, some people might think I sound a bit Machiavellian, but there are ways to perhaps provide some subtle pressure if there is resistance or there is a lack of commitment, to create that commitment through using an external focus. Of course, I can say all these things now because I'm out of the corporate world. I won't press on Joyce and Pedro, but again, anything you wanted to say in terms of leadership commitment?
I mean, I was scrolling down the questions.
Sure,
and,
please go where you want.
Since the time was almost done, I also was reading a question around, you have newcoming people always in your organization, and how do you manage really to keep the standard high on being inclusive? And I think what is important, and one of the things that we are doing, is really include this from the beginning. This is part of your first days at DAO. We show them all the ERG or network groups that we have. So not only LGBTI, as Pedro rightly mentioned, we are inclusive, and that's throughout everything that we do. And we do that from the start. It's part of who we are. And I think if you have such an onboarding, let's say onboarding training, or you put it in your onboarding policy, that brings you a long way.
Joyce, thank you so much. I'm also just reading down the messages as we go. A message from Mike saying we've really reached the end of the session, and apologies if we haven't covered all your questions. If there are any outstanding, please feel free, any audience members, to drop me a message via LinkedIn. Happy to follow up on those. As I say, follow up for the Workplace Pride Toolkit and further links on the Workplace Pride website. A big, huge thanks to Pedro from Shell and Joyce from DAO in helping me to bring this all the practical steps alive through the dialogue and through the discussion. If we missed your question, apologies, but we hope you've enjoyed this session. I hope it stimulates you to take something back and to do something with the toolkit in terms of your own approach on workplace on LGBTI inclusion. And thank you very much for your questions and your interest in joining the session today. And I'm going to stop the recording now. And if participants would like to click back to lobby, and then from there you can go back into the main session with David and Unilever. Top right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye.